Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar organized by EWA and the Student Press Law Center. We're going to wait a minute and give people a little more time to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you for joining this webinar organized by the Education Writers Association and the Student Press Law Center. One quick reminder to the student journalists who are participating, you can get access to, or you could get connected with some legal help if needed from the Student Press Law Center's legal hotline, and you can access that at splc.org. I'm Marquita Brown. I'm program manager for EWA. And before we begin, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. If you have questions for a speaker, type them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And please ask your question at any time during the webinar. We'll go through the questions at the end during the Q&A. And now I'll present the panelists that we have today. First up is Dina Francesca Haynes. Dina is a professor at New England Law, who teaches courses that include constitution law and immigration law. We also have Katie Mangnan, who is a reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Katie has written numerous articles about Daca, students' fears and related uncertainties, all from a higher education perspective. We also have Corey Mitchell, who is a reporter for Education Week, and Corey's beat focuses on English language learners, bilingual education, and civil rights issues. He has written about Daca from a K-12 perspective. And we'll go ahead and just go through some questions for the presenters, starting with Katie giving a quick status update on where Daca stands at this moment. Katie, would you go ahead and tell us about that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As you all know, I'm sure the lives of hundreds of thousands of undocumented young people were thrown into doubt last year when President Trump ended the Daca program, which had given young people brought here by their parents when they were children certain limited protections from deportation and the chance to get work permits. However, he did give Congress 6 months to fix the problem, which was ambitious given that Congress has been trying to fix the problem ever since 2001 and as part of immigration overhaul, and it hadn't happened. And as you can tell from what happened last week, it still remains just a terrible, something that's just very polarizing and very difficult to solve. So last Thursday, there were 4 immigration bills that all, like within the course of about an hour, were voted down one after another. And that, of course, was extremely discouraging to DACA holders because the deadline that the president set, March 5th, is right around the corner. And starting on that date, if DACA is ended, every day 1,000 young people could lose their DACA status and their DACA protections and be that much more vulnerable to deportation. And that would continue for 2 years until everyone with DACA had essentially lost that protection. There have been 2 courts that have stepped in to challenge and sort of stay that decision to end DACA, but those could be overturned anytime. The Trump administration is trying very hard to get the Supreme Court to step in and overrule those. So It's really unclear whether or not March 5th is going to be the deadline that counts, or whether it's going to be a week from then. But in any case, there's just a lot of people right now who are very, very worried, who thought that by now some kind of solution would have, Congress would have arrived at some kind of solution that they just haven't been able to reach.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful, Katie. One thing is, of course, I'm sure we're all clearly interested in this topic. Would any of you speak specifically to why education reporters specifically should have DACA on their radar, why they should be writing about this issue and how it affects the people in their communities?
I'll go ahead and jump in. From a case 12 perspective, these people are hiding in plain sight. They may be the teachers and the students you're covering, and if they're not the students, their parents could very well be affected. And I mean, this could be impacting everything from student attendance to behavior and everything else. So, I mean, it's an important topic.
And I think from a higher education standpoint too, there are enormous implications for college students, with undocumented college students, if DACA is ended. If you lose your DACA status, you're going to lose your work permit. And a lot of college students are able to attend college just because with DACA, they can get a work permit. Many of them actually work on campus. Once they lose that ability to work, it's going to be very hard for many of them to remain in college. Also, just the fact that uncertainty, a lot of students are wondering whether they should continue in college, not knowing whether they're going to be able to use their degrees when they get out, and wondering, hey, maybe I should just go back and support my family and make money. So there's just enormous ramifications for college education on whether or not the DACA program is continued.
And just pragmatically, the people we're talking about are between ages 16 and 35 because of the parameters that were put on the Deferred Action Program when it was initiated. So the bulk of the slightly less than 700,000 people who have DACA are in their 20s, which puts them primarily in undergrad and graduate institutions.
And bear with me for a second. Of course, when you're writing about DACA, one of the initial challenges might be gauging the size of the population, the estimated number of DACA recipients in the communities you cover. Do any of you have some tips on wrapping your arms around who you're talking about and really putting faces to the story in that manner?
I think just in terms of looking at numbers, I put together a list of sources that I think we'd be happy to share with reporters for just getting a handle on the numbers nationally of DACA recipients and related statistics. The Migration Policy Institute is a really wonderful source for reliable statistics. Then the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, has a lot of good data too. And then there's just a whole bunch of other think tanks and groups that keep tabs on this that I've compiled a list of. And I sort of keep this in Google Doc form so that whenever I or one of my colleagues goes to write a DACA story on deadline, we have a real quick, easy access to all the sources of stats and commentary.
Great. Okay. Dina or Corey, do you want to weigh in?
I'd agree with Katie that Migration Policy Institute has been great at providing numbers and context because there's a lot of uncertainty, especially at the K-12 level. Schools aren't asking the immigration status of students or teachers who may be DACA protected, but they've been able to provide solid estimates on these populations for us.
And I know it's been a while, but when I actually wrote a little bit about DACA, and this was long before some of the major changes that we've seen in the last year, I believe I looked at numbers from the Immigration Department. Are those reliable at all anymore?
I think they are. Dina, do you find them reliable?
Yeah, I mean,
they tend to be a little old, but
because of the caps, because of the deadlines that were imposed, this number of about 680,000 is the number that's been put forward by USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services. I know that John Kelly mentioned something last week or the week before about this, additional missing million people who were quote unquote too lazy to apply, which I take great umbrage at, who really fall outside of the scope of anything that either the president or Congress has made a possibility. So I'm not sure where they're getting those figures from, except that I think that he's talking about the people who could have applied if they had done so before the cutoff date when Trump ended the program.
Some of the estimates, and it might be the Migration Policy Institute, I'm not sure, some of the estimates go as high as close to 800,000. So there's quite a range.
Right. Yeah, I know I've noticed that range as well. And let me see.
A certain number have lost their status already, so that could account for the differential. But I think nobody's got a handle on it. The only entity that could definitively count would be USCIS if they were tracking it and publishing those figures, and
Right.
GAO if they had them. Yeah.
And I believe Katie mentioned an estimate earlier of maybe 1,000 people a day are losing or would lose their status, given.
Yeah, they would lose their status depending on what happens. Like, say that March 5th deadline stayed in place starting March 5th, because people would not be able to renew their status every day. 1,000 people, an estimated 1,000 people would lose their status, and that would just continue every day until 2 years from then, and then everyone would have lost their status.
Can I just say something? So DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is part of DHS even contests whether it is a status, which is part of the problem. It's essentially a promise not to remove somebody who's otherwise removable, and it's been upheld by the courts in a case called U.S. versus Texas, where the court decided that it was within the power of the executive to decide who to prioritize to remove, and conversely, who to prioritize to not remove. You can picture the sort of warehouse of millions of files in different piles, and there aren't enough people in DHS to go out and remove everybody who's removable, which is estimated upwards between 14 and 20 million people. So the president has discretion to choose who to prioritize, and basically he deprioritized this group, and then for the first time created a process for anybody who fell within this category to apply and receive a promise, a temporary promise not to be removed. And it came with work authorization, as Katie mentioned, which is really important. So as the status runs out, one of the key factors is the extent to which your employment authorization expires and what that means. There has been a statement issued by DHS that they won't go out and sweep up people en masse just because their status has ended. I'm speaking with my immigration lawyer hat on when I say I wouldn't trust that statement, and I've seen evidence to the contrary. But I do trust that they're not going specifically, rounding up people. I think the bigger question is what happens when employers see that employment authorization has run out. What effect does that have on a person who's using it in order to work? In some states that issue driver's licenses, DACA is the only thing that's allowed you to get a driver's license. When your driver's license expires, you won't be able to get it renewed again, and so forth. So it's sort of potentially has a kind of practical wind down that affects people differently in different ways. But the other big question mark is we don't really know how any of this is going to play out. I mean, we can't really count on, I think, the statements that have been made because they've been inconsistent at best.
And so I'll start going to some of the questions from presenters, and sort of in line with what you were saying, Dina. I think we're all aware of this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. And I hope I don't butcher your name, but Farnoosh Amiri has the question, what are other good ways or angles to cover the Daca community besides profiles of those who are facing uncertainty?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. Can I jump in? I also have struggled with this because I teach First Amendment law, and I have a deep respect for the press, and I think it's incredibly important to raise public awareness on this issue, especially now while Congress is grappling with whether or not they're going to do something, because that's the only thing that will have some effect if constituents speak up. But with my immigration lawyer hat on, it makes me nervous when my clients, if they contact me before they speak to the press or go on media, it makes me nervous when they do so. So if I were really cautious, abundantly cautious, I would advise them not to speak to the press. Although I appreciate that many people have really valid reasons for doing that. So I think that reporters looking for alternatives rather than individuals is a great idea. I mean, it's kind of, I'm not trying to sort of elevate the status of immigration lawyers, but there's a really obvious group of people who are representing individuals and advocacy groups that did the DACA application process and have done panels on information sessions that would be good resources. A lot of these groups could talk generally about their clients rather than having people put their names forward. And one of the benefits to that, I think, is that in my experience, almost 100% of people with DACA come from mixed status families. So whether or not they realize it, and I think most do, they've given an address that attaches not just to themselves, but somebody in their family or workplace who is undocumented. And I just, anytime the government has access to an address, as a lawyer, it would make me feel reluctant to want to have that information go public.
And so, of course, that raises some ethical issues that maybe reporters should keep in mind when working on stories. Corey or Katie, please weigh in on, how do you tell these stories, other angles, and then, how do you work through some of these issues about the uncertainty in talking to sources in mixed status families?
Yeah, I think the points Dina raises are very valid, and we certainly notice in trying to get people to talk on the record using their names about their concerns and fears that, probably the vast majority of the people that we try to talk to are going to say, I'm just not comfortable with that. And obviously you have to respect that. Very often a person might be okay talking to you, this someone who has DACA, but maybe her parents don't have that protection, and she's worried that speaking out will hurt her family. So, in cases like that, I don't have a problem with just using a person's first name or just telling a person's story without using their name or divulging identifying information. It's something that as reporters we usually sort of hate to do. You want to have as many people on the record using their names as possible, but you also don't want people to be out there sort of exposing themselves and their families to danger. And, I think that very often the people that you can find who are willing to use their names are the ones who have been out there, who have been in newspapers, who have been protesting. They might be student leaders. They're very comfortable and very sort of high profile in the DACA community. They are great to have, but I think ideally it's good to get the sort of everyday DACA person who probably is a little more scared, might be from a mixed status family, might have a lot of concerns and fears that they would be willing to voice as long as they knew their name wasn't going to be used. And that way, in your coverage, you can get beyond just the sort of high profile student leaders, the ones who are very brave, who are out there, who everybody else is quoting, and find the average person who's, you know, perhaps just a little bit more reluctant to come forward, but who has a really, really important story to tell.
Yeah, and I agree with Katie, especially with minors when we're talking about K-12. I'm okay with using first names only. If they're teachers that are DACA protected that I profiled, I will usually use a full name, but I mean, with their consent. I mean, you want to make that very clear that their name will be made public. And people do have reservations. Oftentimes, we have to reach out to these community organizations because you can't go to schools and say, hey, I'd like to talk to some DACA protected students or teachers. You have to sort of work outside, you know, universities and school districts to find these folks. And there's tons of community organizations out there, immigration rights organizations that are willing to connect you with people. And then, you know, you have to be very upfront about, you know, what you're asking them to do when they participate in an interview to share their story.
And I know this was an issue that came up at EWA's Higher Education Conference last year in Atlanta, and I know some of the advice, if I'm remembering correctly, or some of the discussion also, you know, mentioned a point that was made today, that we're talking, and you know, about adults in many cases, and if they understand or think they understand the possible repercussions, the implications of how much of their personal information they're willing to share on the record, that I guess there's a debate over whether that's empowering for them as well. I wanted to throw that out there, and maybe some of the coverage from the EWA Higher Education event is something that we can include in the resources that we share after this webinar. And next is a question from Eric Roblin of EWA. He was asking if Corey can tell us about how many K-12 teachers are DACA recipients, and are there particular communities that have a larger number?
The Migration Policy Institute estimates that number is somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000. Many of these folks are concentrated on the coast, New York, Boston, DC, all throughout California. But for any community that you cover, they're likely to be DACA protected teachers, even if they're only 1 and 2 in a particular school district. Research has shown that many of these folks have gone on to get college educations, and they're able to work with these permits, and they're in the classrooms. And many of them may be your bilingual teachers, your dual language teachers. So they're very important to the school districts that employ them, whether it's through teaching foreign language, connecting with other immigrant students. If you talk to union folks in any of your large metro districts and even some of your mid-sized K-12 districts, they will acknowledge that they have people on staff, but they won't necessarily say, hey, here's this person's number, give them a call. So I think it's a big issue for districts, because how do they replace some of these folks who have a skill that not many native-born teachers have, speaking a second language, and they're able to connect with these students. I talked to some folks up in Boston in the past couple of weeks, and they formed a group, Unafraid Educators, to kind of focus on the needs of DACA protected students and students with DACA protected family members. And they've acknowledged that, you know, we have some teachers too. We don't know what's going to happen when their protection expires. We'll do what we can under the law to keep these folks working in classrooms, but that's sort of a big question that's just hanging over their heads right now.
And I know that we were also wondering, you know, maybe for Corey and Katie, what have been some of the biggest challenges so far? It's sort of in line with what we're talking about with writing about DACA and its implications on students, educators, and schools. And how have you, or are you working through those challenges in your coverage?
I think probably the biggest one is just finding people who are willing to talk on the record about these issues, and just tracking students down. And I think social media is probably the best tool that I've found. I certainly use Twitter and Facebook a lot. You know, you look at hashtags, Daca, or if there's a trending hashtag that you think might be a place where students with Daca might be congregating to talk. If nothing else, just being able to track those on Twitter so that you know what kinds of conversations are taking place. And, you know, I'll direct tweet to students or people who are making comments that seem particularly germane to an article I'm writing, and see if they get back to me. And if they do, we'll start a conversation, and I'll see if they're comfortable talking to me. I might embed that tweet into my story. But between Twitter and Facebook, those are the main ways that I can actually follow the conversations and specifically find sources. Another challenge, just from the college perspective, is that a lot of colleges don't keep track of the number of Daca recipients they have. I mean, I think that's partly just because they don't want to have a database of students with Daca. I mean, the last thing they want to do is to be able to make it easier for, you know, ICE to come knocking and to try to get in touch with students. So getting data from colleges can be a challenge.
Along with getting data from school districts and finding sources, another issue is gauging the sentiment of what school districts are doing to set clear, consistent policies on what will happen if immigration agents show up or local law enforcement agents show up. Many larger districts created, you know, past policies or statements that saying we're a sanctuary district, but I mean, what that means varies from place to place. And if you don't come out and you don't have a very strong statement, when rumors of ICE raids start floating around the community or on social media, I mean, those can have serious implications. So sort of pinning down what exactly schools have decided about what to do, at what point a superintendent and legal counsel gets involved, and what they may or may not be doing to support families is something that's been hard to get at. Because if you hold a public meeting to address some of these issues, I mean, many of these people rightfully will say, well, why should I show up to a publicly announced meeting about immigration concerns and set myself up as a target? So you have to sort of, you know, get a feel for what schools are actually doing. It's easy to say, well, we support, but sometimes it takes more than just a public meeting to answer questions to get at what's really being done on the ground.
Can I
Dina,
just
I know
add?
you want to weigh in.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, sanctuary has many meanings, and it has no technical legal meaning. It sort of depends on what a city or jurisdiction decides to do. But one of the things that most sanctuary jurisdictions have done is prohibit the gathering of information about status, period, which means that it would be very hard in a sanctuary jurisdiction. It should be very hard in a sanctuary jurisdiction for journalists to gather that information if the teachers and all government employees are abiding by the rules that have been set in place by the laws that have enacted a version of sanctuary. So I'm glad to hear I'm glad to hear that it's challenging for you, and I very much endorse the idea of not showing up to a public meeting about DACA or any status, again, out of an abundance of caution. But I mean, just to let you know, California at the state level and then cities within California have been very active about enacting various tough, rigorous sanctuary provisions, including pretty much telling ICE that they have no business being in city or state facilities and on campuses. But that hasn't stopped ICE. There was an ICE deportation officer who impersonated a UPS delivery person who gained access to a Berkeley campus that would have otherwise been turned back because there were people watching for ICE and would have asked him not to enter the building. But he impersonated a UPS delivery person and gained access to the building. And there have been other instances of ICE coming into schools, including a K through 12 school last week, seeking information from a minor about family members, which shouldn't happen. And there was something called a sensitive locations memo that was in effect under the Obama administration that told ICE deportation officers places that they couldn't go into, like schools, hospitals, and churches. But you've seen in the last year and a half, we've seen ICE entering into all of those locations. And in fact, the acting deputy director of ICE, I think he's still acting, announced 2 weeks ago that they were actively targeting sanctuary jurisdictions for broad sweeps, and that anybody who was in the vicinity of somebody that they were looking for was a legitimate target from their perspective. So again, from my immigration lawyer hat perspective, I am glad that people are behaving cautiously, because I think all of this does have an effect. I do, however, think that a lot of it is designed to make us all nervous. I mean, the interesting thing about these Operation Safe City, for example, is that it doesn't take them picking up a vast number of people. It just takes them picking up a few people, and for all of us to then change our activities and perceptions. So I do think press is really important to put all of this in perspective, but I also think that a lot of this is designed to make people feel really uncomfortable and nervous about their futures, and it's working.
And with that in mind, I think we've answered this, but Chihiro Kai asked if revealing the full name of a Daca recipient in an article endangers them or increases their chances of being deported. Again, I think we've talked about this, but is there anything else that any of you would like to add in response to Chihiro's question?
Well, I mean, I'd just like to offer up that we began writing stories about DACA and about the threat of deportation shortly after the 2016 election. And there were a lot more people willing to talk at that point than there are right now because of, the arbitrary March 5th deadline that Katie talked about. People are just becoming a lot more leery and cautious now when you hear reports about raids and ramped up deportation. People are more afraid. And what we got back to is that you have to be very upfront with these folks about their name appearing, and, that anybody can read this. Some people are brave enough to go out there despite that.
And just a quick reminder to the audience, when you're typing your question in the GoToWebinar control panel, please include your name and affiliation. And I will go back to a question from Curtis Allen. Curtis asks about mixed status families and whether any of you can expound on the subject. And the other question is, how would some family members obtain citizenship and not others?
I think it'd be really interesting, and this sort of in line with story ideas you might want to be considering when you're talking to DACA students or DACA recipients. So many of them do come from mixed status families. And so being able to sort of set that person's story in the context of their entire family, like, yes, I have these protections and I can drive without worrying if I roll through a stoplight, but my father, every day when he leaves, I worry about him. Or my sister, because she's that much younger or older than me, was not eligible for DACA. So yes, I have this protection, but she doesn't. And I think when you look closely at those relationships within families, you can understand why so many people, DACA supporters, have wanted what they call a clean DREAM Act. And they worry so much that what they don't want is a path to citizenship for themselves if it means that their loved ones, their parents, their siblings are more likely to be deported. And I think you can sort of get at some of that tension by looking at a family and what it would mean if these various proposals were to pass, that yes, I would get protection and be able to become a citizen, but there's going to be such a crackdown sort of in other respects, that my family members are much more likely to be deported.
And a lot of DACA recipients have younger siblings who are citizens because you acquire citizenship by birth in the United States. The other factor that's been making people nervous is that there was an exemption from a federal crime that made bringing somebody across the border a federal crime of smuggling. And there was an exemption for family members who smuggled other family members. And Congress has been perpetually looking at that, and the Attorney General has been perpetually agitating for changes in the perception of that. And if that were to change, that would be a drastic, that would have a drastic effect on DACA recipient families, because the implication would be that undocumented parents of or siblings or other family members of DACA recipients who were brought into the United States by their family members could be prosecuted for smuggling. So there have been tangential cases that have been coming up, not directly with family members being involved, but it gives some legitimacy to concerns that that's sort of a balloon issue that people are legitimately concerned with.
And there's a question from Ellen Austin from the Harker School. And Ellen's asking, do you encrypt any of your interviews via platforms like WeChat or other encrypted apps to avoid the possibility that your interviews are accessed or eavesdropped on?
That's a good amount of paranoia. I like that.
I had not thought of that, but I mean, perhaps at some point we will have to go to that. I think that if you're taking that amount of caution, maybe we shouldn't be speaking to these people directly anyway, if there's that much of a threat. I mean, there are other ways that you can cover the story without talking directly to some of these people that may be losing their DACA protection, that can sort of get at the heart of the story without possibly identifying or leading people to some of these folks. And
would you elaborate on some of those ways?
I just think that some of the stuff that I pointed to earlier about getting a sense of what schools are doing, focusing on what Congress is doing or what your state legislature may be doing, what sorts of decisions local police departments are making. I know that I was talking to folks that run a charter network out in Los Angeles. They actually invited the LAPD into their schools for a session to talk about how that particular department is not cooperating with federal immigration authorities. I mean, it seems risky, but I mean, it sort of, lays out how complex an issue this is. I mean, the layers of law enforcement that may or may not get involved in this. And alternatively, in Boston, which I mentioned earlier about, the teachers union there working to support undocumented students and staff members, there have been complaints from immigration rights advocates there about school resource officers who are embedded in the schools, tipping off ICE authorities by the language that they use when they file reports. There's even been a student from a high school in Boston that's been detained for the better part of a year because he was identified after a fight in school. I mean, so you want to cover the people, but you can also cover the politics and the policies of this all to help inform people about what's going on, because there's a lot of fear and uncertainty. And if you can help bring some clarity to the situation, that's always a positive.
And those examples are great, and it makes me think that the Los Angeles Police Department has been far out front of any other police department in the country in resisting ICE, but even they will honor judicial warrants. Everyone will honor a judicial warrant. And one thing that ICE has been doing that I guess allies could and should know about in the school system would be to know the difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. I have them both here. I don't think anybody can see them, but I urge you to look up. The difference is that a judicial warrant is signed by a judge and pretty much has to be honored by any police force, regardless of whether they're a sanctuary jurisdiction or not. Administrative warrants have a heading Department of Homeland Security at the top, and they list deportability grounds on them, and it's signed not by a judge, by somebody within the Department of Homeland Security in the deportation office. And ICE has been regularly trying to intimidate people in school systems by showing administrative warrants and implying that a person who doesn't honor them or allow ICE in has something to fear. And as long as they're a US citizen, they have nothing to fear. They should ask the individual to leave the school if they're being shown an administrative warrant. If it's a judicial warrant, that means somebody has reason to believe that somebody has broken the law and they've satisfied a burden of proof such that a judge will issue a warrant. So that's a different story. The problem for Daca and anybody who's not a US citizen is that you don't need to be prosecuted for a crime in order to be deportable and put in detention. You can be picked up by ICE for any inadmissibility or removability ground, which includes being out of status. And many people will end up, with the help of a lawyer, getting out of detention, but being in detention is no fun at all. And it usually will lead to deportation, with some exceptions, which I kind of wanted to point out. I mean, some things that schools, especially universities, could be doing would be to create funds for students who are Daca recipients to get individualized legal advice from a lawyer, because there are some ways in which people who currently have Daca might be eligible for green cards or to otherwise remain in the United States lawfully or to avoid removal. And you can't find that out by just searching on the internet or reading a generalized article. You really need to know about the particular factual situation of a person. So while I wouldn't recommend that anybody go to a general information session, I think getting individual legal advice is really crucial. And schools that want to do something could create slush funds to make them available to Daca recipients to seek that legal advice.
Yeah. And we have an interesting question from Terry Buckner. Terry's question is that teachers should be able to acquire HB1 status if they teach in a shortage area, especially bilingual classes. However, it is costly for the district. My question is, did the districts not do paperwork for HB1s when a teacher could be included in Daca to save money?
That's a really complex question, but when Corey was speaking earlier about the 8,000 to 9,000 teachers with Daca that might suddenly not be teaching, it reminded me that the last time we had a big shortage of teachers, school districts trafficked people into the United States from the Philippines and India to teach on H-1Bs, but then abused them, and these people filed lawsuits, which you can read, against the actual school districts in Texas, Louisiana. Those are the two that I remember off the top of my head. But I guess I'm not sure I understand the full question of the prior person who asked it, but you can't know whether the school went through the process of getting an H-1B, but they're costly. They take a lot of time. Schools don't like to do them, and even when they do use them, they've used them in exploitative ways sometimes, like this instance where the teachers were trafficked.
And we have a question from Michael Elson Rooney of the Teacher Project. Mike asks, how would getting rid of Daca affect college students who currently qualify for in-state tuition rates because of their Daca status? Do you think states will take any action to protect those students if Daca ends?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on the state. I think some certainly will step in and try to do whatever they can, and others, those students may just be very vulnerable to having to go back to pay, prohibitively high out-of-state tuitions. So yeah, that's a good question. It's a very good, a real fear that I think people face that's going to be determined on a state-by-state basis.
There's a resource I can try to link afterwards that runs down state laws and their decisions on in-state tuition and what they've said they plan to do with respect to DACA recipients.
That would be great, yeah. And I know we've gotten a number of questions dealing again with data and for example, there's one from Ben Silver with Citizen Advocacy Center in Illinois. And Ben wants to know whether there is any statistical information on US-born students with parents who have DACA status. And I think we've also had another question about where you can find specific examples of universities that have policies to refute. Well, that's a different thing. Let's go back to the data and where you can get information on who we're talking about. And I don't know if they're about the status of other members of the family. I don't know if I butchered that.
I hope there's no information. Because schools shouldn't be collecting data about the status of parents. That's right. From Plyler versus Doe, we have pretty clear case law that says that schools shouldn't be doing that, regardless of whether they're sanctuary jurisdictions. So as to whether there are statistics, I don't know, but I hope there aren't.
But I think when we're covering DACA recipients, I think it's good to know that there are, and it's good to note when we're looking at kind of the diversity of people who have DACA, that there are people who have, you know, maybe in their late 20s, 30s, who do have children. You know, the DACA, the sort of typical DACA recipient that you think of as a college student, but there are a lot of people who have children now who are U.S. citizens, and I think also we have a tendency when we're talking about DACA to focus primarily on people from Latin America, and of course there are DACA recipients from all over the world. And so I think it's really important to look at a wide range of ages and socioeconomic backgrounds and different statuses when we're writing about DACA students.
Okay. And this is a question from Larry Gordon of EdgeSource. And it's in line with what we were just asking about, but what is a good source of statistics on countries of origin for DACA recipients? And is there anyone in the Trump administration or INS who responds with some speed to questions?
That's a good question.
Okay, anybody?
What do you think? Does the Migration Policy Institute, they would probably have information on that, wouldn't they? I've just had really good luck with them.
Yeah, that would probably be the best source that I'd recommend. They respond with speed to media requests, especially as far as the Department of Homeland Security or the White House. I mean, that's a bit of a different story.
And they started a hotline for people to call, which I would not recommend calling because it's geared towards allowing citizens to make complaints against people which yield deportations. It emanated out of one of the executive orders, and it was supposed to be for people to report crimes of violence committed against them by people without status, as if you could know by looking at somebody what their status was when they committed a crime against you. But what happened was that immediately it started becoming a place for people to call and report, basically engage in racial profiling and make assumptions about people's status and report them. Whether or not those are transmitted to DHS and DHS acts on them, we don't know. In the past, they wouldn't have. They would have just written those kind of tips off. But I think it's probably a safe guess to say that they have a different opinion these days, but I don't know whether they're actually utilizing the information for removals.
And I know that we've talked a little bit about some of what college students who are DACA recipients might face if the program ends. And one question is, you know, if that happens, if DACA ends, what would you elaborate a little bit on some of the barriers undocumented students might face in completing their college educations?
I think one of them is that people could lose their work permits, and as Dina mentioned, it's unclear whether they would immediately lose their jobs, but they could. And without the ability to work and pay for their educations, a lot of students would probably be forced to drop out. So that's one. If you lose your driver's license, and you might be reluctant to, a lot of people who don't have driver's licenses drive anyway and just hold their breath and hope they don't get pulled over. But again, rolling through a stop sign could lead to deportation. And so that's just a little too scary for a lot of people. It'd be another reason that people might be reluctant to continue their college education. And then the whole uncertainty about whether their in-state tuition, if they are eligible for that, will continue or whether that's likely to go up. It's another big potential barrier.
We have a question from Roxanne Reddy of Campus Current at Anne Arundel Community College. Do you have specific examples of universities that have policies which refuse access to ICE agents?
The UC campuses do. If you're asking whether I have the policy, I don't. But I think that they made it public, at least part of it. And you can look in sanctuary laws at the city level and see the language of the laws, which sometimes include access provisions about all state and city entities, which could include some campuses. But I mean, to be clear, nobody can really refuse entry to a valid request by the federal government. But the valid request comes in the form of a judicial warrant and nothing else. And I guess just to be clear again, the only people who don't stand to lose from that decision are US citizens. So we can all be allies by asserting the rights that we have, in favor of people who have more to risk by asserting them. Like saying, no, I will not show you my citizenship status when asked on a bus or a train by CBP, which thinks that they have the authority to racially profile people and ask them to establish their citizenship, for example.
And we're running a little low on time. One thing that I wanted to follow up on is, again, when we're talking about sources of information and statistics, would you restate the organization that is responsive to media requests? It was the Migration Policy Institute, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And are there any other sources of that sort of information that you would recommend reporters check out as they're tackling these stories?
I have a whole list of them that I'd be happy to share with you that I think I sent over on the Google Doc. Maybe we could share that with them. And I have the phone numbers and links to those and the PR folks. I also included a couple of think tanks that are more sort of right-wing think tanks, because I think it's important just in balance to talk to people like the Center for Immigration Studies, the Federation for Fair American Immigration Reform. These are ones that are very sort of pro-crackdown on immigrants. And, for the sake of balance, sometimes you need to check with those think tanks as well for their perspective.
And CIS, the citizenship, what are they called? Center for Immigration Studies. Has the most up-to-date map of sanctuary jurisdictions. The only caveat is that it's unclear what sanctuary jurisdiction means. So they sweep up with a pretty broad brush and include everyone. But if you wanted to know what cities and counties and states are sanctuary jurisdictions, they have a pretty up-to-date map.
And, of course, the question that we always ask is, what are some of the stories that reporters really should be writing as they try to cover more about Daca and the communities, people affected by it? Is there any other sort of takeaway that would be important for reporters and other members of the audience to get from this discussion? I'd fumbled through that question, but let's go with the story ideas.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing that we haven't addressed thus far, or at least I don't think we have, is that we often tend to see these letters from dozens of college presidents or dozens of school district superintendents saying that, you know, we're behind efforts to pass the DREAM Act. But I mean, there are thousands of colleges and tens of thousands of school districts. I mean, if you're covering these places where a superintendent hasn't come out, I mean, maybe ask them, like, what is the district's stance, to provide clarity for people, for some of your readers. I mean, maybe they are, and maybe they are of the mind that there needs to be immigration reform and immigration restrictions. But asking those questions, I think, will help clarify if people aren't very outspoken in their support of immigration reform and passing a DREAM Act.
Is there any particular story related to Daca that you think reporters should tackle, Dina? That you wish reporters would tackle?
I like Corey's idea, and I think it's interesting when campuses in particular decided whether to be sanctuary campuses. I know a lot of them specifically avoided the name because they feared that it would encourage ICE to visit them, and there's something to that fear. And I think just talking to college administrators further about what their thought process is when they make those decisions, what they think sanctuary means when they chose to become a sanctuary campus or not. And I guess I just, from, again, the legal protection side, I would just caution reporters to report anything that gives sort of broad or generalized legal advice, because I think that it's misleading in that it doesn't tell anybody's specific alternatives to Daca or solutions that they might have. So I know it's tempting for campuses to have information sessions and whatnot, but I would discourage that. So I would discourage the reporting of those as well.
Excuse me, I just want to break in and say I enjoyed being here. I have to go catch a plane, but just good luck to everybody in covering this really important topic. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out over the next couple of weeks. Good luck to y'all.
Great, Katie, thank you so much. And I'm sure we're all itching to get that list of resources from you too.
I will send it over. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah. All right, and I think that's it. Yeah, one of the last questions was about the resources and how they would be shared. You can check back at ewa.org. We would share it, as well as splc.org. I'm sure Katie will share her list with both organizations, and Dina and Corey have mentioned some resources and other helpful information as well, and we will share that. In closing, I want to thank our guests again. And on behalf of EWA, I would like to thank the audience for participating. As the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps us improve. Again, you can go to ewa.org to sign up for more of our upcoming seminars and webinars. And again, I need to reiterate the legal hotline and other resources for student journalists through the Student Press Law Center. Thank you again, everybody, for participating, and check back for a recording of the webinar and some of these other resources that we mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you.